This is a 20-inch f5 Obsession telescope, and today we're going to review it. So in case you stumbled across this channel just wandering around YouTube, you may be wondering, what in the world is this thing? Well, it's an astronomical telescope designed for looking up at the night sky. Telescopes are rated by their clear aperture, that is the amount of light that they gather, and this one has a mirror in the back that gathers light, about 20 inches worth. This is fairly large. A typical amateur telescope would gather anywhere between, say, 4.5 and 8 inches worth of light. So this one's gathering a lot more light. You can see a lot dimmer. It directs the light into a secondary mirror here. I do have a cover on it for safety purposes because we are outside here in the daytime. Reflects the light out into here. This is where you look at the eyepiece. To change magnifications, you change eyepieces. Now the mount is what they call an alt-az mount. It's a fancy word. All it means is it moves up and down like this, and left and right, and we call it a Dobsonian base because it's named after San Francisco astronomer John Dobson, credited for popularizing its design several decades ago. Okay, so before Obsession came along, large Dobsonian reflectors were, well, I don't want to say they were cheap, but, well, maybe they kind of were. A lot of them had sonotube tubes, solid tubes, that's cardboard to you and me. Many of them were homemade, and we didn't think of them as premium products. Along came Obsession, came out with this line of telescopes, and suddenly it created a brand new niche within our hobby, the premium Dobsonian. So again, these are not cheap. When I first met one of these models in the mid-1990s, they were around $4,500 US. Towards the end of its production run, close to $10,000, and by then the f5-f ratio had shrunk to f4. So, but depending on the options and accessories you got with it, you wanted to add a couple of $1,000s to that because inevitably you're going to buy something else. And if you bought, for example, the Argo Nevis electronic go-to package, you could count on adding another $3,000 to $4,000 to the price. So again, towards the end of its production run, probably wanted to budget around $15,000 US to get a fully fledged, fully outfitted model of one of these for yourself. Now, you notice I did say towards the end of its production run because as I'm filming this right now, Obsession is transitioning from this, now what they're now calling the Classic series of Dobsonians, to the new UC, the Ultra Compact series. I have previous reviews on this channel of the 12.5-inch Classic series and the new 15-inch UC series. I'll leave links in the description below if you want to take a look at them. So of all of the classic series of Obsession Dobsonians, this is probably the most classic of them all. This is the model that many credit with starting the premium Dob revolution, and this is probably the most popular of the series that I have seen. So with this 20 inches, the start of the really big ones that they had. They had a 12.5 and a 15. Those might be thought of as the smaller Obsessions. They have an 18-inch Classic, which is probably in the middle, and then the 20s and above were the start of the really big ones. So if you do want to get one of the new UC models, note that they don't make a 20-inch model in that new series. They make an 18 and they make a 22, so you're going to have to decide which way you want to go. Okay, so just for comparison, here is the 20-inch Obsession compared to a mere mortal-sized telescope. This is the Orion XT8. It's an 8-inch Dobsonian, and in fact, it's pretty much the same telescope except shrunk down, and this one has a solid tube as opposed to the open truss design here. But this is the model you always see me recommending on this channel. This one has an 8-inch mirror in the back. It's got the same diagonal mirror and the eyepiece out the side here. So you might be wondering, what's better about the Obsession than a commercial grade Dobsonian like this one, which sells for anywhere from $600 to $800 US? Well, what's better? It's pretty much everything. So the mirror is a handmade mirror by someone who is a master optician who specializes in large aperture reflector mirrors. And in fact, when you order your Obsession telescope, the mirror usually comes shipped separately directly from the mirror maker himself, and Obsession themselves never actually sees the mirror. It just comes in a separate package. Mechanically, things are so much better. So this is a little bit stiff. I don't know if you can see this on the video. It's okay, it's serviceable, it's not bad for the money. This thing is silky smooth. I mean, it will stay put and it will move with only a few ounces worth of effort. The bearings are Teflon on Formica. Those are the two materials that are used here. And you'll notice in particular the sizes of the side bearings here. This diameter here, the bigger that bearing, the better the motions. And in fact, Dave Kriege of Obsession likes to say that the diameter of the bearing should be at least the diameter of the mirror. So we have an 8-inch telescope here. That thing's not even close to being 8 inches, but again, for the price you pay for this thing, it's okay. Look at the size of the side bearings here. You're going from here to, I mean, this is like a 24, 25-inch diameter bearing, and it's so large they don't even bother giving you the top half of it. And this is Formica, this is flooring laminate here, and Teflon on the bottom is the other material. It sounds a little strange if you've never seen this before, but Teflon on Formica is a terrific set of materials for telescope bearings. So here's the mirror cell, and traditionally a mirror cell was something really heavy and rigid that would just crank on the mirror and hold it steady so it couldn't move. This takes that whole concept and it stands it on its head. So this looks really complicated. It's actually not. The edge of the mirror sits on this sling. It's actually a seatbelt type material. It's just on there. There's nothing really holding it on. And these triangle assembly things, they're just bearing the weight of the mirror when we tilt the telescope backwards. And they call it a flotation cell. And that's what it is. The mirror is just hanging out in space like this. So I'm often asked, how does this thing hold its collimation, its alignment, if you take it apart and put it together, if you drive it places? And I'm often surprised at how well these things hold their collimation, even through multiple disassemblies, even through transportation. And I think the theory is that there's so much mass here, this mirror weighs close to 50 pounds, that when you put it together, it's going to tend to settle in roughly the same position so that only minor alignment, only minor collimation is necessary. And these are the collimation screws that you use here to align the mirror. Another nice feature is when you buy an Obsession telescope, you get a personalized nameplate with your name and the date on it. Okay, so a few months back, I was contacted by a club member who had left this area and had put a lot of his belongings in storage, and he didn't expect to be back in this part of the country for some time. And he said, you know what, I've got this 20-inch Obsession, it's just sitting in storage, why don't you just go get it and use it, and then we'll deal with it when I get back into this area. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to do that for him. So when I got to the storage facility, it wasn't the self-storage type, you know, with the garage doors that go up. This is a long-term storage facility. The inside of this thing looked like the ending of Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know, where they have the rows of crates stacked high. And he had to contact the place a week in advance just so they could get his belongings down into this staging area. And he wasn't even sure which one of the containers it was in. So we spent quite some time looking through all this stuff, trying to find the telescope. And of course, not all of the parts were in the same containers. If I had known how much trouble I would have caused this guy, I might not have done it. So one thing about this long-term storage facility is that they charge by weight. So one advantage of doing this is we had to weigh everything so that they could figure out what his new fee would be. And if you look at the scale, look at the number in the distance there, it's 203 pounds with everything here. And if you take off the wheelbarrow handles, which weigh about 8.5 pounds apiece, you're getting somewhere between 180 to 190 pounds worth of telescope right here. So as you see it here, there's really only two differences between the way I have it set up here and the way you're probably going to have it set up. The first one is there is a shroud in this bag, and it covers up this entire open truss area. I've left it off for the time being just so you can see what's going on inside the telescope. The second thing are these wheelbarrow handles here. They screw into these little holes here. I instead have it on a rolling dolly that I built. Sometimes I use the wheelbarrow handle, sometimes I leave it on the dolly. Okay, so let's show you how this thing works. Now, you may think just based on the size and the weight and the apparent bulk of this thing that you would never use this. And, well, actually, some people do never use theirs, but we'll talk about those people later. But if you stop and think about it, a telescope is mostly air. A telescope is mostly nothing. There's nothing there. The whole purpose of the structure, no matter how you do this, is to hold the two mirrors steady so that you can look through the eyepiece. How you do that, open truss, solid tube, it's up to the manufacturer. The second thing is they've had a lot of time to refine this design to the point where all of this stuff collapses down to the point where you can actually get this inside a small car. Let's show you how that works. Okay, so here's the unassembled telescope, and before I even do anything else, you can already see just how much smaller this thing has gotten. The upper truss here actually doesn't weigh very much. The mirror box assembly, yes, that weighs in excess of 100 pounds, and it's an unwieldy 100 pounds because it's something like a 20-inch, 6-inch square. I have put the wheelbarrow handles on just so you can see how those work. If you did have to transport it, I've got it on the rolling dolly, I know. I've got rolling dolly and wheelbarrow handles. Yes, it's a belt and suspenders. But if you grab the wheelbarrow handles on your own, it actually is not that much weight for you to lift. Okay, so the upper truss here, it actually doesn't weigh very much. And by the way, this purple bag I have here being used as a secondary cover, in my travels and in meeting those of you across the country, I am surprised at how many of you are using that bag from a Crown Royal liquor bottle to cover your secondary. I don't know what this says about us as astronomers. Are we all heavy drinkers? Okay, so as with any open truss Dobsonian, there are three parts. There's the mirror and rocker box at the bottom, there's the upper truss assembly at the top, and then there are the truss poles in between. This one is no different. Things are just a little bit bigger. So we can set the upper truss aside for a moment, and this is an 8 truss design, and there are 8 of these, and there are 8 receptacles down here. And I'll tell you, some people are really concerned as to which pole goes into which slot, to the point where they'll number them. They get really picky about this. Me, I don't care. I just put them in any way that I can. And really, the only thing I want to look for is that this one here has to clear the side bearing. So they have cut the insulation up here to the point where you can do that. And there's usually 2. This one's over here. Okay, so when you assemble any open truss Dob, it is very important to leave both mirror covers on, whatever they may be. And it's especially important for the mirror cover on the primary. This is the last thing you take off. Leave the mirror cover on. The reason is very simple. You don't want to be dropping things on the mirror. Okay, so the assembly of any open truss Dob, you know, the moment of truth comes in that time when you have to set the upper truss on top of the poles. This is true with any open truss Dob, and the problem is there will be at least some moment in time, some gap in time, where the thing's going to be sitting there unsecured. And there's no difference here. We're going to run into that same issue. But they have come up with a couple of things to make this a little bit easier for you. First of all, on the upper truss there are these receptacles here that are designed to take the angle of the poles and get them off your hand as quickly as possible. Second of all, there's a turnbuckle arrangement here, which I'll show you in a minute. So on the smaller Obsession Dobs, there's a nut and bolt arrangement that holds the upper truss to the poles, and it's not that bad. With something this big, the nut and the bolt is not going to be good enough. They had to come up with another arrangement, and so there's a turnbuckle arrangement. Let's go ahead and do this. You can either left justify or right justify where the focuser is. I'm just going to go ahead and put the focuser on the right-hand side, and you've got to set this on here. Okay, so here we are. It's on here, but there's nothing actually securing it. Okay, so here's a demonstration. Now, normally, keep in mind, this would be vertical. I've got this down here just so you can see it. But you can see there's a cam lock mechanism here. This is how it closes, and it's on a bolt that goes through this trapezoidal object here. And you can see that this is deliberately fit so that this trapezoidal block will fit in here. So here's the problem. See, this pin is supposed to go through here, and then you close down on the cam to lock this down. So this is actually a little bit too loose, so I'll exaggerate this. If you back off too much, you see this is way too loose. Now the upper truss is just going to be just hanging loose. But if you do it too tight, let's exaggerate it the other way. If you do it too tight, and you're not going to you're not going to be able to tighten down on this thing. And if you visit Obsession owners, you can look at this. You will see an epidemic of these pins that are bent from people closing down too much on this cam. So the trick is to find a sweet spot here, not too tight and not too loose. That's not bad. That's about right. Okay, so here we are with the scope assembled. The only thing, again, that I have not done, there's a shroud in here. I'm going to go ahead and leave it off just so you can see what's going on inside the scope. So what can you see with such a telescope? Well, quite a bit. You know, you can often tell the kind of telescope a person has by the kind of atlas they're using to find things in the night sky. If you have a small telescope like this Orion Star Blast, this is a 4.5-inch telescope that you see me recommend quite a bit. Very often you see these people using this. It's a planisphere, and it shows you what's up in the night sky. You dial in the time and the date, and it shows you what's up. This is roughly equal to what's visible to the naked eye, or perhaps a little bit deeper. If you have a mid-sized telescope like this Orion XT8, very often you'll see them using something like the Cambridge Star Atlas, or this, the Sky and Telescope Pocket Sky Atlas. This is the Jumbo Edition. How can you have a Jumbo Edition of a Pocket Atlas? I'm going to have to take that up with Sky and Telescope's marketing department. Okay, but if you have a telescope of this size, pretty much within reason, anything is open to you, anything is game. And your star atlases start getting big and heavy like this Sky Atlas 2000. This thing is so well worn and beaten and the lamination is coming off of it, but that's the sign of a well-used and well-loved atlas. So looking at familiar objects here begin to take on a whole new dimension. Globular clusters take on an almost 3D effect, and again, familiar areas of the sky start to look decidedly unfamiliar. I know the Virgo cluster fairly well, but when I look at the Virgo cluster through this thing, I wind up thinking to myself like, whoa, what's that? I never saw that before. You know, you're panning from one object to the other and you see other galaxies careening by and you have to go look up and see what's over there. Similarly, the area around M81 and M82, which many of you do know very well in Ursa Major, try looking at that through one of these. You're going to be surprised just how much stuff there is. So you're going to be limited here not by the telescope, but probably by your seeing conditions and by your skill as an observer. You know, when I first moved here about 20, 25 years ago, I could use a 20-inch obsession and pretty much find anything I wanted to see. These days, this place has gotten discovered. There's a lot of new neighborhoods coming around here, and light pollution is starting to encroach. For me to use this thing to its full extent, I've actually got to take it somewhere at this point. But I'll tell you one of my most interesting observations I've ever seen through one of these. So many of you know what a globular cluster is, M13, M3, M5. These are gatherings of several 100,000 stars that look like sort of sprinkles of sugar on velvet through most telescopes. Through a 20-inch, they are individually resolved. But I've seen, I believe, every globular cluster that you can see from the northern hemisphere. If I want to see more, I have to go to the southern hemisphere. But there is another option. You can actually see globular clusters in another galaxy. You see, I've run out of the ones in our galaxy, so I'm going to go look at some in another galaxy. So it actually is theoretically possible to see globular clusters in the galaxy of Andromeda, that's M31, in the fall. So there's one globular cluster that people usually go after first, and it's referred to as G1, and you have to get a specialized star chart, and you have to get online to find out exactly where it is. And it took me all night to see it, and it didn't look that great, but I did see something that was in the right spot that was obviously not a star. I saw a globular cluster in another galaxy. Okay, so other minor considerations, let's tackle these one by one. Where do you store it? Well, if you have a permanent observatory, that's great. I'm jealous. I don't have one of those. I store this thing in my garage. I don't have any problem doing it. Some people are concerned about condensation on the mirror during rapid temperature and humidity changes. What you can do is put a drop light underneath it. Just leave it on all year long. It raises the temperature of the mirror just a little bit, keeps the condensation off. Finder. I don't have a traditional optical finder on this thing. I have a Telrad. It is a red dot reflex sight. It projects a red bullseye at infinity. I find that's usually sufficient for what I want to do. Eyepiece. Get a low power eyepiece. This is a 35mm panoptic from Teleview in here. Keep the magnification as low as possible. This thing has a 2500mm focal length. You're going to be pushing the thing around a lot. And yes, they have made it so that it is a pleasure to push, but you don't want to be going crazy with a high power eyepiece. Keep things reasonable. I would say a 35mm panoptic or a 31mm Teleview Nagler is a necessity for this telescope. You know, in my travels around the country and in talking to you, I am often surprised how many of you have one of these things. I'll be talking to somebody and then they'll just mention, you know, I got a 20-inch obsession in the garage. And, oh, well, that's good, that's interesting. And I find the biggest concern about people who have one of these things, guilt. Guilt for not having used it enough. You know, they spend all this money on it and then it doesn't get used. Well, think about it this way. I think of a 20-inch obsession, a telescope this large, as a special occasion telescope. I take it out on special occasions. It's a dark, clear, moonless night where I want to see something. I have guests over and they just want to look at it. Think of it that way, and maybe that'll take away some of the guilt. So anyway, here's the overview of the 20-inch obsession. I hope you found this interesting. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.